All right, so today we're joined by another great former Walt Disney Imagineer and author of Inventing Disneyland, Alastair Dallas, who started at the WED Architectural Department in 1975, Disneyland's Space Mountain, and then later worked on the Epcot construction site from the entrance plaza all the way to the Odyssey restaurant, and then eventually made his way to Tokyo Disneyland in 1982. Alastair, we're thrilled to have you with us today. It's going to be a great conversation about your incredible career.
Delighted to be here.
We're happy to have you with us. I want to start by going through your early career and your eventual career to Imagineering.
Well, when I was a kid, we moved to Southern California, and I went to Disneyland for the first time. Within a few years, I was convinced that this was what I wanted to do with my life, was make places like Disneyland. And I really thought I was like the only kid with that thought. But over the years, well, especially from inside Disney, I see that a lot of people get bitten by that same bug and continue, I'm sure. And so I really wanted to learn to be an architect. I wanted to convince Disney to hire me, and they were not interested in an unpaid internship when I offered it to them, because they said they had college students who would do that. So I ended up working at Magic Mountain, which had just opened in North Los Angeles County. And I worked in the planning and development department there as a gopher, basically. But it meant that eventually I got asked to come to Disney, and I was, I think, the youngest they had hired. It was a paid role, actually, but I was a junior drafter. I learned an incredible amount there. And then went on to work in architecture, get an architecture license eventually, and I came back at Disney to Disney in 1979 when we were just gearing up for Epcot. I worked on a bunch of things in Future World, and I came to a realization at that point that I kind of got it wrong. I shouldn't have wanted to be an architect. By that time, I was doing architecture, but what I really wanted was to be a set designer. Because my hero is Bill Martin, and he was there working on the Mexico Pavilion, and a lot of what they were doing with sort of creating a mood, creating a feeling of being someplace else, like Mexico. And then I met a fellow named Dave Ott, who had been instrumental in designing the Cinderella's castle at Walt Disney World, and a long list of great things. And Dave was working on the Canada Pavilion. And they were kind of replicating actual buildings, doing it scaled down and doing it with different materials and different construction methods, but so that it would look right. And I thought that was just great. And here I was stuck working on Future World.
You did amazing work in Future World. And you talk about immersive experiences and going someplace where you feel like you're in another place. Like you walk into the Mexico Pavilion, and that's probably one of my favorite pavilions there. And you walk in, you get a burst of air conditioning, which is also nice in the summertime.
Yeah,
but it's also, you're in this other world. You're in this place where you feel like it's dark out. You're in a market. You have the restaurant, you have the water, you have the attraction, and it's so immersive. And you talk about the castle, how that castle was designed. And I think there's no bricks in the construction of either castle, as far as I understand.
Can't scale them as easily.
You mentioned you worked with Bill Martin.
You know, most of the folks that had known, who had known Walt, were just really, really pleasant people, you know, and they tended to be older. And so they were very patient with the younger kids like me. There were a bunch of us in our 20s on Epcot, and Bill smoked a pipe, and he would, you know, just listen to you and say, well, that is, you know, something we could think about, you know. He was like Mark Davis, or Ken Anderson was also very generous with his time. Herb Ryman, they were all working on these things, and they knew roughly how long things take to gel. So, you know, 20-year-olds, we would come in there and it's like, well, I gave you this thing yesterday. Have you figured it out yet? You know, it's like, no, it's, you know, calm down, relax. John Hench and Marty Sklar couldn't be as generous with their time. They were really in the thick of it. They were the decision makers for just about everything. and George Restor was also involved in all this. But meantime, you could walk into Ryman's office and he'd show you what he was doing. It was great.
What I find fascinating, learning about the people that were around Walt Disney, is how did he find the best of the best?
Yeah.
It's like there's no other place that I could see, from architecture, from animation, story design, working in the model shop. I mean, all these things, they were all the best, and he found them all.
Well, the thing is, if you had an ego, if you were going to be feisty and fiery about your career and all that, Disney probably wasn't for you.
Yeah,
that was the lesson. I think there were one or two show designers who were a little standoffish. I think more than ego. But yeah, I remember Mark Davis, for instance, would it put artwork outside his office, and if you asked him about it, he'd be glad to give you the whole pitch about what he's proposing for a design.
Yeah,
it was just great.
Yeah. From Haunted Mansion to Pirates, that's all Mark Davis. How was the culture there working around these great minds?
Well, there was, I think the studio was organized the same way. Come to find out in research that there was the creative side, which is like, tell me your ideas. Let's brainstorm here in the hallway. And then there was another track that was management. It's like, we have to get these things done on time, so you have to be sitting at your desk to work. And I kind of run into the boss of the drafting department was a man named Dave Jacobs. And we got to be very good friends. But when I was first there, I was fascinated. I was down in the model shop, or I was over at the research library. And, I would come back to my desk and there'd be a little see me note. And I'd go over to Dave's office. It's like, look, have we got these drawings done? Well, I'm going to stay late. It's like, yeah, all right. But I want these drawings done by the end of the week.
In the track in Imagineering, where does the architectural department come into play in the timeline from conception to full scale model, or being decided to go into the parks?
It can go a number of different ways. It might start with a sketch, and maybe that sketch is to scale, and that would be more of an architectural input. To scale, to make sure that you've got enough space to do all the things you need to do, and you've got clearances for average sized people, things like that. Or it could be a sketch on the back of a napkin, and a show designer has ideas for what happens. Or it could be somebody maybe in the model shop just sort of, gluing some popsicle sticks together and saying, what, something like this. There was a famous joke. It's famous in my circles. They were working on an Africa pavilion for World Showcase, and they had these big, rounded, smooth rocks. Someone had built the rocks the way they were planning to in the model, but then over here they had put a separate rock, and they had split it open and put sour cream and chives in it with a little plastic fork stuck in it, because that's what the rocks looked like. It was all baked potatoes. So they had a good sense of humor, and they could do anything. If you wanted food, they could do food, like a kitchen cabaret at Epcot, or they could do buildings. So a lot of times architectural would come in and say, well, okay, there's the model, and here's the conceptual rendering. Now we need scale drawings of this so that they can build it. And I think maybe American Adventure was that way. It sort of seems as if they started with that overall rendering of the front facade, and then they assumed that a theater would fit in there. And sure enough, architectural was able to fit a theater in there. There's lots of extra space in the lobby, that sort of thing, and it just works. But something like the Odyssey restaurant, it was very intricate to get all the different functions in that building and make them all fit in the space that we had.
So let's move to the Odyssey. You mentioned it was not originally called the Odyssey. It had a different name to start.
That's right.
Before it became the Odyssey. The story behind that.
It's a good story. The thing is, we were working on Epcot when it was just very general, very vague. We didn't have the overall model of it yet and things like that, but we knew where it was going to be on the site plan, the whole park. And we knew Future World was up here and World Showcase was down there. There'd be a big lagoon. And we kind of proceeded on that basis. And they began doing studies of where people were going to eat and where the restrooms should be and things like that. And they realized that most of World Showcase was going to be high-end restaurants that require a reservation, and people were going to be very hungry. And they decided that right about the middle, right about where the Plaza Inn is at Disneyland, is where you're going to need a high-capacity food service. And so we started working on a restaurant complex there. Maybe it would be more like a food court. Maybe it would be a burger joint. We didn't know. And so they had a kitchen consultant, a fellow named Doug Peak. He designed all of the kitchens for all of Epcot and World Showcase. And so he knew that, sort of the high to the low. He knew exactly what was needed. And he said, yeah, it's going to serve burgers and fries and soft drinks. And so we need this kind of capacity, and it's going to need to be completely enclosed, and it's going to have, all these requirements and things. And so we started designing it. I worked for a project designer named Gordon Hoops, and Gordon designed the Tomorrowland Terrace at Walt Disney World. So he knew that sort of idiom, and Odyssey looks a bit like Tomorrowland Terrace, actually. And that's the way Gordon conceived it. But I got to be much more involved with this project than others, and I took it from a design to actual working drawings that they could build. And but then the soils engineering company, Dames and Moore, came out and said, well, as we've cleared the land, we've discovered that there's a big sinkhole right in the middle in Future World and World Showcase. And so we said, well, what can we do about that? You can't build on a sinkhole. Are we going to fill it in? And they said, well, it would be, if you fill it in with dirt, it will continue to sink, and there may be no bottom. So there's not much you can do. Maybe you could pave over it, but you couldn't put a building on it because it's going to settle. And so they said, we recommend water over the top of this sinkhole so that it will give a nice even pressure. So we had water now at that point in the middle of the project where we hadn't planned it before. And it might have been Gordon, it might have been our structural engineer, Kent Bingham, but somebody came up with this idea of, well, you can build a pier. Why don't we build it like a pier? We'll piles into the water, and we'll float the restaurant above all that. And that has a lot of implications in terms of plumbing and things like that, but it worked out. That was what we decided to do, except these structural engineers came and said, okay, it may still slip. And if it slips, the whole building can't be occupied. We have to red tag the building. We built it on piles that had built-in sensors. And those sensors get checked, I think, every year. And if they show any slippage, they have to cut the use of the building. So we ended up designing this whole building like it was a restaurant at the end of a pier. And it makes a really nice reflecting pool. The building looked pretty nice.
I wrote an article on the website about the Epcot Sinkhole. It's great that you brought this up, because I was going to bring it up later, but I'm happy you brought this up because it's so fascinating, and it's something that not many people know about. I was not aware of the sensors underneath the buildings. Is that checked every single year just to see if there's any movement?
And on that bridge, there are brass caps. You open those brass caps and the sensors right down below.
Not just the restaurant, but also on walkway bridges as well. All the sensors are there.
We had to go through a process of clearing the trees from the area. I was down there at the mid-'79 when they were still clearing trees, piling them up and burning them. And only then could you really see the structure of the soil underneath. And they were building drainage canals and things because things were spongy and wet. But if you could, if a simple drainage canal would make it dry, then that was fine. But if nothing you did made it dry, then maybe you had a sinkhole. And so the soils engineer people were going crazy and sitting behind trying to make what had been completely obscure into something that they could build a huge theme park on.
You mentioned Gordon Hoops. He also worked on the entrance of Epcot and I believe designed Spaceship Earth's layout. Were you involved in that work as well?
I was, yeah. I was lucky enough to work with Gordon pretty much the whole time. After I came back, I worked for Gordon continuously. Yeah. Spaceship Earth was originally going to be something more like the half or three-quarter geodesic sphere, something like the Montreal 67 sphere that Buckminster Fuller did. And I think it was Gordon's idea that if we could lift it up on legs, we could express the entire sphere underneath, and that would be pretty cool as a way to come into the future underneath this Spaceship Earth. Spaceship Earth, of course, the concept came from a write-up that Ray Bradbury had done. He was hired as a consultant, and he had done a very poetic thing about, we're just passengers on Spaceship Earth and all that. So that became kind of the theme of Future World.
I tell people, if you want to get a real taste of what Epcot Center was like in the 80s and 90s, go ride Spaceship Earth. And the engineering for Spaceship Earth is also fascinating. When it rains, there's this drainage system. So if you're standing under Spaceship Earth, you're not going to get wet. It doesn't drain off the sphere.
That's right. It's not actually an active system. It doesn't suck the rainwater per se. We covered the entire ball with a black waterproofing membrane. And then at each node intersection, we have a little aluminum standoff at 2 feet, and that holds up the aluminum facets on the outside. So there's this 2 foot, roughly interstitial space, we called it. And you can actually, there's a hatch in the very top. You can actually get on a vehicle and let yourself down on a cable and roll between the area in that little 2 foot space, just like you have a crawl space under a house. So you can go and do a repair or something if you need to. But then right around the belt line, there's basically a gutter, just like you have on your roof at home. And that the rainwater hits the aluminum facets, but they have gaps between them of as much as a half an inch. The rain just naturally goes in there, hits that black membrane, and rolls to the gutter. And the gutter then channels the water away to World Showcase. I worked on that main entrance. We know that it rains a lot in Florida, so it seems pretty normal, I suppose. So we have 2 covered walkways leading up to the sphere. But that wasn't written anywhere. We knew to do that because when it rains, people need to be undercover. So the ticket booths are undercover, and then you can walk in the pouring rain. You can walk up to Spaceship Earth and get on the ride without getting wet.
That's good project planning, thinking ahead, knowing that it rains for about 10 minutes a day, usually every day in the summer. then the sun comes out and dries everything up. But also it's good shade too, because the sun's hot.
Oh, but yeah, I mean, it's the same sort of planning where bathrooms. If you ask where the nearest bathroom is, they're not going to say, oh, well, you have to go to the other side of World Showcase. It's about 1.5 miles from here. We have bathrooms in strategic places where you need them. Something like Spaceship Earth, it has a project designer, that was Gordon, and it also has a project engineer. And that was the way WED was set up. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same way now. Project designer, project engineer, and they have responsibilities that for working together. Doug Stapp was our project engineer for Spaceship Earth, and Doug became very concerned that we were putting aluminum panels 180 feet in the air. So he had one sent to a testing lab in Pennsylvania, I think. They simulated a lightning strike on the aluminum panel, the aluminum facet on the outside, and it survived, but it got a pretty good crater. The aluminum we used is a sheet of aluminum and another sheet of aluminum, and in between is like a garbage bag material, polyethylene. And so we took that sandwich panel with the electrical force, and it melted the plastic inside, and so it deformed and all that, but it didn't go all the way through, and so it couldn't affect the actual building inside. This was going to be sort of a lightning screen, and presumably the entire understructure was going to be given a sort of a lightning rod protection. My point is that he thought about it well in advance, and we were testing that to see if aluminum could work for this. Because we could have gone with, lightweight concrete or something, plastic. something that wasn't going to conduct electricity.
And has this design with this aluminum exterior compound, has this been done before in other places, or was this like new for the time?
It was pretty new at the time, but the product is called a Leucobond, and I've seen it in a lot of university buildings and things like that. It's fairly expensive, but it lets you. It's very dimensionally stable, so it creates smooth planes on a building, and then you can do things like rounded corners, and so I've seen it used for that effect in places.
Going to that park, especially during the early days, and just seeing all these structures, seeing the designs, the engineering, everything was so big. Gordon Hoops had the right idea. You walk into this place, you see Spaceship Earth from far away, and you get there, and it's like, okay, now I'm here, and this is massive 180-foot structure. It's incredible. And I think that's one of the things that brings people back to Disney World and Disneyland and Disney parks in general. They may not think about it in the moment, but they remember these structures, they remember these buildings, they remember these sites of something they've never seen before. And I think it's a testament to the work that you've done and other Imagineers to create that immersive environment, that environment that they're not going to find this environment anywhere else in the world. And I think that's a testament to the great work that you and your teams have done.
Thank you, on behalf of all the rest of the team. But yeah, the thing is, there are a lot of things considered, and it's, rain protection is one, but also John Hench was very concerned with the colors of the buildings and the colors of the plants and the colors of the concrete walkway and the colors of the monorail going by, and that they all be sympathetic to each other. And so your vista at any given point, wherever you turn to look, tends to be well composed and balanced. And that sort of thing is it's just really hard to get right unless you've got an organization that has been thinking about that since the first line on paper. And that's why I think the real world is a little more chaotic and less memorable, maybe.
You were there on the construction site. You see this incredible park getting built. Did you envision that it would have become the park that it is over the past 40 plus years?
No, I guess not. I thought the Magic Kingdom would maintain more interest for people than a future world sort of thing. But then I visited again in the 90s, and I saw Animal Kingdom. So, I realized that there's room for a lot of different experiences at Walt Disney World.
Horizons was probably one of my favorite attractions.
Yeah.
If not my favorite attraction. These attractions are disappointing when they close and get replaced by Mission Space, which is if you have some level of motion sickness, it's not great for some people.
Yeah, they had the show model before I left Disney. The show model was built, and you could walk through it and see the scenes in order for Horizons. The show designers, a fellow named Tom Fitzgerald, who is still there, and he was another one of those Joe Rohde sort of characters. It's like, yep, listen to that man. He knows what he's saying. There were a lot of folks like that, but that second level generation, Tony Baxter and Joe Rohde and Tom Fitzgerald. The cool thing is to see how Walt Disney Imagineering actually promoted talent. I didn't realize it exactly at the time. On the other hand, they were always looking, especially at the younger generation, to see, maybe you could handle a little bit more of an assignment. You could do a little bit more, and they moved people along. And people who stayed longer than I did, Tom Morris was doing sets for the Spaceship Earth ride when I was there, and he went on and he designed the Paris Castle and all these other great projects. So I mean, it's very impressive that they had sort of like baseball will have farm teams, and they eventually get up to the big leagues.
A couple other Imagineers that I've spoken with said that same exact thing, where they were given an opportunity. You either do it or you don't. And if you succeed and you impress, the Marty Sklar's of the world, you're going to go places. And I think, those Imagineers have, and we see like Tom Morris, he was given that opportunity to show who he is and what he was able to create.
Exactly. I think you mentioned Marty. That's the guy who I think created that culture. That was just sort of his, something that he embodied. Maybe this isn't your time now, but we're not forgetting about you. Give it a little time. We'll see what you can do on the next project. I was friendly with Marty's secretary, and I sent a memo or a proposal or something to Marty, just kind of threw it over the transom, as they say. And I asked the secretary, has he seen it? And she said, Marty would never ignore anything. You will get an answer. I guarantee it. It just takes time because he's got an inbox like this. He was right. He came back and he said, not at this time, but perhaps, but a bunch of us younger folks had some ideas, and eventually, more or less, they all eventually got done. One of the things we wanted to do was a ride that might be different each time. And they did that in Indiana Jones 15 years later. So obviously, smart people came up with that idea, maybe on their own. But ideas at Disney tended to be put in the drawer and eventually would come out, and somebody would resurrect them and when it was their time. But that was an idea that we pitched to Marty about, the multi-way track and that kind of thing. And he took it and thought about it, and eventually it happened.
There's so many different attractions and concepts that from over the past 40, 50 years that have never gotten done. And just, things from Adventureland to Fantasyland and Mount Fuji in Japan. I mean, the Africa Pavilion, World Showcases has so many concepts that never came to fruition. Obviously, there's budgetary concerns and other issues, but like the Rhine River cruise in Germany would have been fantastic. You can't build everything. I understand that.
I understand they've added a Ratatouille ride in
yes.
France Pavilion. That sounds great.
Impressions de France film. It was actually the oldest attraction in Epcot, unchanged since 1982.
Does that mean that the Canada film is different now too?
Yes, I believe the Canada film is in its third iteration, as far as I understand.
Interesting over the years.
Yeah, Canada still kept the song. It's the same lyrics, but it's a different singer. But they've kept that consistent. Okay. American Adventure is very underrated. You talk about animatronics and film and story. 30 minutes of air conditioning, which is also nice. And a lot of the animatronics are on these like platforms underneath the theater, underneath your seats, and they roll out.
Very complicated,
and they were very complicated.
Funny, the feeling when I was there was American Adventure might just be impossible to do. They would talk about these ideas that they had for lifts and rolling platforms and all that, and we were all, well, I'm glad I'm over here on my project, and you have a good day, with that one. But they made it work. Randy Bright, who unfortunately passed away way too young.
I'm glad you mentioned Randy Bright, instrumental in the American Adventure and many other projects.
You've got to have a champion who sees the whole vision and sees it all the way through. And that varies, I guess, on different types of attractions. But yeah, the show design group, Tom Fitzgerald and Bob Weiss and folks like that, they would make sure that the electronics department has what they need for controlling the show, and then they would make sure that that everything gets recorded. Exitencio was another one of the show designers. They would pull it all together. Architecture is subordinate to that, just like structural engineering is subordinate and model making is subordinate. But the relative involvement changes project. There was one guy, I can't remember his name. His first name was Al. I went by Al. So I remember that much. He did all the door hardware. This was before databases, basically. He did this all on pencil and paper to keep track of how many hinges we had to order, how many doors that locked on one side, and then how many doors that didn't have locks, and how many door handles. And it was amazing. But he made sure we ordered all of the door stuff that we needed, and he didn't slip up at all that I know of. I was involved in the theatrical drapes and rigging across the project as well, which is just like the door guy, only much, much less complex. We subbed out a company called R.L. Grosh and Sons, and they provided all of the drapes. I mean, the American Adventure was obviously a big, huge curtain, but there were curtains in The Land and various other shows. And these guys did all of the curtains. I was the resident engineer for those things, which meant that I had to make sure this was supposed to be here by the 15th. It's the 14th. Is it going to be here?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, another thing regular guests wouldn't take into account, like the work that goes into getting this installed and getting this prepared. It's such an amazing project in theme park design.
I have a lot of respect for Imagineers who really came up with something out of their imagination. I didn't get to do much of that. I have to say I'm pretty boring vanilla architecture stuff, but the load unload area for Spaceship Earth has a kind of a curved ceiling and there's a matching curve on this low wall. And I was reminded the other day, I did that. That was my design.
Your name should be written on there somewhere. And yeah, that's great. Now, I'll think about you when I ride Spaceship Earth.
All right, I appreciate that.
Excellent. You also did some work in Tokyo Disneyland as well, correct?
That's right. We sort of rode herd on a lot of different contractors to do Epcot. There were just maybe a dozen or more. A lot of them from Detroit, actually. But Kishman and Company was involved, Morrison Knutson. Anyway, the point is, riding herd on contractors was very important because we had work stoppages and things like that. The quality control wasn't always there. They would do something and it's like, well, that's not what it says on the spec, and you'd have to go back and forth with them. And they needed somebody to do that in Tokyo, so they sent me to Tokyo. The Tokyo team had pretty much done, everything. It was just a question of actually finishing it and opening it. But I was the quality control officer for the whole project. And that meant compiling a very big punch list of things that needed to be fixed before we could open and working with the Japanese folks. And it was just night and day compared to the U.S. contractors who were, tussling with us and labor negotiations and things like that in Florida. In Tokyo in 1983, they were, horrified if we didn't like what they had done. And if we said, no, the art director says this stain finish is just too dark. It has to be lighter. And, it's like putting less salt in the soup. It's hard to make stain lighter. And, the painter would just be beside himself. And he'd bring in lights and he'd stay there all night to make it lighter. And we'd see it the next morning. 5 o'clock, we say it has to be lighter. Next morning, 8 a.m., he's made it lighter somehow. And it looks much nicer. And the art director signs off. It was that kind of an environment in Japan. I was very impressed. But then we had some big deals where the Skyway, we wanted the Skyway to work the way the Skyway worked at Disneyland and Magic Kingdom, and come into the station and be steady. And they wanted it to be more like a ski lift, where it just continuously went and you jumped into the cabin and took off. And I think they won that one. I think that's how it opened. So we had some big issues where we were really kind of arguing with the Oriental Land Company to do things our way as opposed to the way they were more used to.
Tokyo Disneyland, I feel like there's a lot of original architecture there, especially when it was built basically simultaneously with Epcot Center.
Well, hiring.
Yeah, right.
Well, a busy place.
Absolutely. Again, thank you for telling all your stories. You wrote a book, Inventing Disneyland. Tell us about your book and where people can find it.
The thing is, I began to realize that Disneyland was created by the same sort of people I was working with in the 70s and the 80s, and they hardly get mentioned. A lot of stories were being written that Walt wanted this, so Walt built this. That wasn't the whole story. And so I wanted to dive deeper. I also wanted to give people a sense of how designs developed. There were a lot of things that were intended about Disneyland that were pretty much shucked off, after the first opening. They didn't survive the first contact with the customer. And so Disneyland evolved over the years, but that first year was key. So anyway, I wrote this book, Inventing Disneyland, that is chronological. So you can go kind of week by week and you can see, okay, now they hired this guy and that meant this got a little bit more real. And then they hired this guy who knew about trains and he was going to put in the train line. And, just one thing and another. And then the panic in the weeks before opening, it opened. Oh my gosh, the panic after opening. And, it was an interesting story to me. It hadn't really been told. Now we've got things that are a little bit more accurate and more understanding that a lot of people were involved. But when I wrote the book, that was kind of a new idea.
It was a very hot day, and the concrete was still soft, and there was a variety of other issues. Some rides were breaking down.
Right.
So I'm interested in learning about that from your book. So thank you so much for writing that.
Good deal. And if I'm going to plug things, I'm also the admin at a Facebook page called Disneyland of the Past.
Excellent. I'll post it on the show notes. I'll also post a link to your book as well, if you like.
Good deal. I'm unpaid on Disneyland of the Past, so it's just for fun.
Absolutely. It's good to know the history of the park and the people that have made it a reality.
I think you do a great job on the current, the here and now too. I'm glad you cover it all.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for joining us. You're always welcome back. Any other stories you may have about your experiences within Imagineering, just let me know, and we'll be happy to have you on the show again.